So welcome back to the Third Age Reforged faction showcases, and as I said, this time we're going to be looking at the Dwarven Kingdom of Erebor, and naturally they do have quite a lot in common with the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm as far as their central army composition goes. They do obviously have some pretty substantial differences in how they play, and for the most part I would say this is something that I'll go into a little bit more at the end, but Khazad-dûm for the most part put a little bit more emphasis on having fewer but more quality focused units, whereas Erebor can field a bit more of a numerous but balanced army. So in many ways I do think Erebor are a little bit more user friendly, whereas Khazad-dûm take a little bit more to get the most out of. But you know, there are pros and cons to each way of playing, but we'll go right into their army composition here, starting off once again with the siege, and they have a basic, actually no, they don't have a basic ballista, do they? I think their ballistas are slightly stronger, although they don't have any sort of fancy name like the High Elven ballista does. Slightly more expensive, but you know, the gains that you get from this are somewhat limited, but for the most part in a straight shootout with other standard ballistas, the Dwarven ballista should be able to come through for you, but then there is always a little bit of a margin for error with siege, a little bit more of a random chance. And then of course they do also have the catapult, the Dwarven catapult, so this is multi-shot. I'm not sure whether Erebor are going to keep this in the long run, but for the time being it is certainly a tool that you can use to panic your opponents into coming towards you. One of the few times maybe a piece of siege equipment could be used in a 1v1 situation on a map like Grassy Plain. But for the most part this is something you're going to be seeing in sieges more, and in a defensive siege in particular this could, you know, be the sort of thing which really quite worries the attackers. But now we'll move on to obviously the centre of their army, which is going to be their infantry, and as with the other Dwarven faction Khazad-dûm, there's a lot to be said for the Erebor infantry. Starting off at the front with the unit that they share with Khazad-dûm, and that is of course the Dwarven miners. A little bit strange as far as militia tier units goes, although 450 is a good deal more expensive than most militia units. But they are, you know, decent in terms of their stats. Their defensive stats are a little bit lacking compared to even some of the lowliest human militia, but that is because they lack a shield, they lack the armour that most of the Dwarven faction has, but they essentially trade this in by being an effective unit against armour, which is something which is pretty good for a price point of 450. I mean, it essentially makes them have quite a lot in common with some of the units like Orc Maulers or Greenwood Lumbermen, only a little bit more quality from a unit like this. So you do need to be careful with them, otherwise they will start to fall apart pretty quickly. They are certainly not a tar pit militia unit, you do need to use them a little bit more carefully than that, but they can do quite a lot of heavy lifting for you against the right target. Going back a bit further, another unit they actually share with Khazad-dûm is the Mercenary Guildsmen. Again, if you need a little bit more in terms of your line, the Mercenary Guildsmen, essentially the reason to bring them will be the numbers per unit, because they obviously have 180 men per unit, but they are a little bit more lackluster in terms of morale compared to the central core of Dwarven infantry, which we'll get onto in a moment. But you know, not a lot of money to spend on them for 575. They've got decent stats across the board. They are essentially a nice baseline unit for you, and provided you keep inspiration units close to them, they should do a decent job for you, but there's nothing really too special about them. Now we move back into the centre of the Dwarven line, the Ironfoot units for Erebor. Now, it might be tempting to compare them to the Legion units from Khazad-dûm, and you could, but the Ironfoot warriors as a general rule are slightly cheaper, and the Legion units are slightly better, but the Ironfoot units also tend to have more men per unit, so it is quite complicated as to when each of these units is going to be superior to the other. But the Ironfoot warriors are of course the basic melee infantry of the dwarves. And looking at some of their stats, I mean, total defense of 18, you can always expect the dwarves to pack on the armour, and 8 armour is a decent value indeed, as well as a shield value of 7, defensive skill of 3, but honestly in terms of a defensive, like a total defensive number, this isn't all that much better than something like a more defensive Kingdoms of Men sort of frontline line infantry unit, like the Gondor infantry, but it will still do a pretty handy job for you on the front line. Obviously 8 attack is pretty good as well. It's actually better than most Kingdoms of Men units because they wield an axe, which does increase their base attack. And they also have an upgrade model over here, so they have that extra armour, which of course makes the dwarves very tanky. They're going to be very resilient to arrows on the front line. It's going to be quite difficult to get the most out of them, and they don't cost all that much either. I mean, 550 is not an awful lot to spend on a unit of this quality. And then we move on, of course, and these are all Ironfoot units, and all of the other units aside from the standard warriors come with the armour upgrade essentially already applied. This is the Ironfoot spears, of course, so they can make shield wall. They have bonus fighting cavalry, and actually before we move on, the Ironfoot warriors can also make shield walls, so in a similar vein to their brethren from Khazad-dûm, the standard Dwarven infantry has access to a formation usually reserved only for spears, which can make their mass very difficult to combat. and obviously you'd expect that from the dwarves, but Ironfoot spears, they still have that of course, and that bonus fighting cavalry, and you can expect to see the Ironfoot spears quite a lot, because while Erebor certainly do have a few more tools to deal with enemy cavalry, as we'll get onto a little bit later, the Ironfoot spears are still very useful for warding them off from the sides of your infantry line, which can be very important. So I think these are going to be a bit more common. Obviously 625 is not a small amount of money to spend on them though, the warriors are cheaper. And then we get onto the two polearm units, starting off with the Ironfoot halberd, 650 for these, obviously pretty much your standard halberdier fare here. Obviously they do have some pretty good stats though, including an armor value of 9, which some lesser halberdiers won't have access to. Obviously bonus fighting cavalry, can form phalanx, effective against armor as well. Very, very solid choice against factions which are pretty heavily reliant on their armor. Very good for their front line in that case. Obviously without a shield they are a little bit more vulnerable to arrows though, even with that hefty armor bonus. But if you're facing a faction in which you think reach is going to be a little bit more important, then of course you have the Ironfoot pikemen, which are your longer range variant. Obviously 725 is not a small amount of money to spend, but they do have good stats for a pike unit. Honestly, you're going to have to look pretty hard to find a unit which is going to be offering this much value for money from this sort of unit. Obviously the Uruk-hai pikemen can be considered quite a similar unit to the Ironfoot pikes, but obviously bonus fighting cavalry can form phalanx. Very, very good. You can't blanket your line too easily with them based on the cost of both these and the Ironfoot halberds, but positioned correctly in your front line, then they can really help your standard warriors and spears do some damage or keep the enemy infantry at bay. But if you feel as though a little bit more quality is in order to try and help break down your opponent, then you have a unit like this, the Axe Guard of Erebor, which are of course a slightly higher tier shock unit, higher stats across the board of course, with an attack of 11 and an attack of 14 and a charge bonus of 11. They can be quite potent when you hit the enemy in the right place, and a total defense of 21 as well. An armor value of 13 is no mean feat, and a defensive skill of 8. So, you know, if you come up against sort of potentially even some of the more skill-based swordmaster units from the Kingdoms of Men, they're not going to do very well against the Axe Guard of Erebor, because they have the skill to stand up to that sort of thing, and they have the armor to which a non-AP unit is going to struggle to get through. Obviously effective against armor as well, as a two-handed axe is wont to be. But they only have 1 HP, and they don't have a shield, and they do cost 825, so they will be targeted by enemy archers, or crossbows, or javelins potentially, you know, because they are such a threat on the battlefield. The other option is a slightly higher sword and board unit, higher tier sword and board unit I should say, and that is the Erebor Legionaries. They too can make shield wall, just like the Ironfoot warriors, but obviously a little bit more of an emphasis placed on defense as opposed to the Axe Guard of Erebor. Defensive skill of 8 is not half bad for a unit like this. Shield value of 10 as well is approaching the higher end of what you can expect from a standard infantry unit. Any higher and you start to get into some of the very few great shield infantry units that are in the game, and obviously an armor value of 11. You can see that the dwarves really start to pack on their armor when they get into the higher tiers. But 950 is not a small amount of money. You can have several of these before the cost increases, so if you really want to go quality heavy, you can adopt a similar sort of strategy as you would do with the Guardians of Khan Doom, for example, or the Castamir's Legion, but you will pay for that in other aspects of your army, so you do need to sort of make sure that you're going to be fighting a little bit more of a ground war as opposed to a mobile fight, if that is the tactic you want to take. And now an embarrassment of riches really in terms of the level of General's Bodyguard tier units that Erebor can bring on foot, starting off with the Sons of Durin, and this is essentially just the multiple HP shock unit that you can bring and put your general in if you so choose, with a Warhammer. So again, this is a unit which can be compared to stuff like the Tharbad Warhammers or the Witch Realm Enslavers from Rudar, that sort of thing, only this is very much the dwarves' bread and butter, so you can see very good stats across the board. Total defense of 23 is very good for a unit without a shield, especially considering they actually have a higher defensive skill than armor, which is rare in the dwarven roster to be sure. Obviously multiple HP as most General's Bodyguard tier units are, but an attack of 18, charge bonus of 12, and that is AP as well. So a very, very deadly unit. They always have been ever since they were added. But maybe not the safest place to put your general. If you were going to go for 2 of these very high tier infantry units, you might want to put your general in the other one, simply because that lack of a shield can mean they do get focused down, because they are potentially so dangerous. Your opponent is going to single them out and try and mark them for death. Perhaps a more common pick for the Dwarven General's Bodyguard unit is the Highborns of Erebor, and this of course comes from the fact that they are a sword and board unit, so they can sit very happily and very comfortably under arrow fire for the most part. Total defense of 32 puts them up there with even some of Imladris' units, of course. Their armor value of 10, defensive skill of 15, shield value of 7, which is, you know, actually less than the Erebor Legionaries, but to be honest with you, they don't really need it considering all that armor, and also they have an extra HP as well. Good melee damage as well, honestly, with their attack of 16. Charge bonus isn't really too relevant, but obviously they inspire nearby troops, as most General's Bodyguard unit do. definitely the conservative choice, which honestly means that as the dwarves you might, well, facing the dwarves you will probably run into these guys quite a bit. Now a unit which is perhaps somewhat more niche, we have the Obsidian Guard, which is a non-AP attack focused unit, because they are of course a dual wielding unit, so you can look to these guys to be similar to something like the Harbingers of Castamere from Umbar. Obviously they inspire nearby troops, they frighten nearby enemy infantry, they look really cool as well. I really like the look of this unit. But if you have a look at their stats, obviously defensive skill of 17, this is obviously only really dual wielding units are going to be reaching the high teens and into the 20s, as we've seen before with stuff like the Dragon's Wrath Guildsman. But obviously an attack of 19, a charge bonus of 12. None of this is AP damage, but it's going to be very, very difficult to break these guys down in melee. And this is perhaps a unit that you're going to want to bring against a faction like the Elves, for example, where the Obsidian Guard can honestly lay a bit of a beat down on quite a lot of Elven units even. They can definitely go toe-to-toe with quite a few of those kinds of units, and obviously if you run into enemy factions which don't really have a lot of skill, then the Obsidian Guard are going to be able to withstand them all day long. But again, like most dwarves, they are a little bit, you know, they pack on the armor value, so they do sort of make up for the fact they don't have a shield slightly with the HP and the armor, but even so, probably still going to be the target of arrow fire. And then the final unit that you can choose to put your General's Bodyguard in, essentially the analogous to the Mithril Guard from Khazad-dûm, the Dragon Slayers of Erev Mithrin, which are of course 2 HP, but they are essentially one of the very few sword and board units in the game which are AP, effective against armor. They can make shield wall as well, they frighten nearby enemy infantry. Fantastic stats across the board in addition to multiple HP. Apparently they have an armor upgrade, although I think this is going to be one of those units where it's sort of very, very subtle changes in terms of the unit model. But of course if you choose to upgrade your armor, that's just going to make them all the more difficult to bring down. So again, Khazad-dûm, Erebor certainly have a few options in terms of these high tier infantry units. They are only individual units, but they can really help sort of bolster your front line of Ironfoots just over there to a great extent. You know, Erebor's infantry is in some ways inferior to Khazad-dûm's, but in some ways it's also superior. It really depends on the situation and how you like to play. But something else which Erebor have is a few more cavalry options, and I think a little bit more in terms of their ranged contingent. So we'll move on to that next and talk about that. So immediately you can see they've got quite a bit more going on in terms of cavalry than Khazad-dûm did, but we'll start off with their ranged contingent, which is somewhat similar and yet quite different. Starting off with the Ironfoot axe throwers, which are a lower tier axe thrower than the Khazad-dûm reclaimers that their dwarven brethren in the Misty Mountains have, but obviously bonus against cavalry, effective against armour. Not terrible stats in melee, all things considered, so they can sort of be makeshift infantry once they have expended all their ammunition, particularly with that total defense, makes them a pretty decent tar pit when all is said and done. You definitely want them to expend all their ammunition quickly. Obviously axe throwers at close range can be brutal with those AP missiles, but they are liable to be targeted by the enemy in some fashion, whether that is trying to get at them with cavalry before they sort of release their axes, or trying to whittle them down from a distance, although the dwarves are a little bit more prepared for that than many other factions, like Rudar would be, for example, simply by packing on that armour and having that shield value as well. But other than that, they are pretty basic in terms of axe throwers. I mean, 750 is not a small amount of money to spend, but against the right opponent, they can really do a job for you. If you're coming up against some heavily armoured infantry, and you really want to sort of turn the advantage on the infantry fight in your favour, then go for it. You can also use them to ward off cavalry, but in terms of sort of going for a cavalry suppressant, shall we say, this is probably the unit you're going to want to go for, and this is really the main difference in the skirmish lines between Erebor and Khazad-dûm. Where Khazad-dûm had long range, pretty high quality archers, Erebor has really solid crossbowmen, and the Ironfoot crossbows of course very resilient to being counter skirmished because of their armour and their slight shield value, so it's not easy to try and bring them down. And as I've said in the past before, unless you can destroy a crossbow line entirely quite quickly, you're probably better off not wasting your archer ammunition on them, because really your opponent isn't going to mind too much, because crossbows have such stopping power for most of their unit lifespan. I mean, you really have to narrow down the unit quite a lot before they start to lose their effectiveness terribly. Very good at warding off cavalry from your flanks, or the front even, so they are definitely a real problem for cavalry players. And also in the late game, if you've got nothing to answer, then there's really nothing to stop the dwarves from trying to kite you to death if they've got more than one unit of Ironfoot crossbows. Definitely a very big plus point to their army, as we said with Cardlan last time. They can be really good. Obviously it's something they share with Isengard as well, so very, very strong unit. You're probably going to see them 9 times out of 10 when you face Erebor on the battlefield, simply because of how good they can be. 800 is not a small amount to spend, but there is also these guys back here if you wanted to spend even more, and that is the Blacklock Engineers. And just look at their missile attack, 14 I believe they have slightly more missile weight, but obviously they have those AP missiles as well, because they are essentially the super crossbows of the game alongside the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen from Rune. They can also use stakes before the battle starts. Obviously at 1300 this is quite a lot. They are one of those generals bodyguard tier units after all. But they also double as pretty effective infantry as well. They've got decent stats, obviously not to the same level as some of the dedicated generals bodyguard infantry units, but they still have that multiple HP. They still have a pretty high total defense when all is said and done, and decent missile attack, decent melee attack. But the charge bonus is obviously not too much to write home about, but they're solid. And honestly, if you're expecting to be bogged down in a little bit more of a skirmish fight, then they can be a pretty good choice. And obviously in a siege, if you get them in the right position near the end, they can basically win you the game. But over here, we find the real difference, I think, between Khazad-dûm, other than the crossbows and the archers, and Erebor, and that is the cavalry. Now this is an area in which they share a unit again with the Merc cavalry, obviously the quintessential melee cav of the game. You know, nothing too special, but they will really do a number on most lancers in the game. It's really going to be a multiple HP lancer that gets their charge to connect well with Merc cavalry that outright wins. Other than that, they can really get good value. And then also they have the armor upgrade as well, although again there isn't too much difference in the armor upgrades here, but obviously this just makes them a little bit more resilient in melee and to archers at range. As we saw in the last fight between Cardlin and Lothlorien, they can be, if they're used well, they can get value very, very easily. 600 is not an awful lot to spend on a unit like this, but it is in the 100% lore-friendly goats that Erebor really finds a bit of distance between themselves and Khazad-dûm, starting off with the Ironfoot war goats, which I think, based on the fact they don't have a bonus versus cavalry, are pure lancers. So they obviously have that armor-piercing charge, which is a charge bonus of 17, which is somewhat unique. But they do have a very devastating charge. 950 is quite a lot to spend on a unit which honestly is quite vulnerable. Now they do have an armor upgrade if we go over here, which slightly thickens them up a little bit, which obviously makes them a little bit more resilient to ranged fire, but ultimately without a shield and without multiple HP they can still go down pretty heavily, and obviously 950 is not the sort of money you want to spend on a unit which doesn't do anything in the course of the battle. But even so, if you keep them moving, they can do very, very well for themselves, but you do need to protect them. You need to have Merc cavalry with them at all times, I would say, because if you do, that's quite a potent cav force, and only really the cavalry-focused factions will be able to deal with that without breaking too much of a sweat. So they are a bit of a risk, in my opinion. But one thing that certainly is a little bit more scary to see if you're a cavalry-focused faction would be these guys, and that is the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. Obviously they inspire nearby troops, bonus fighting cavalry, frighten nearby enemy infantry. They have a big bonus against enemy cavalry in melee. They are essentially, I'm not really sure what best to compare them to, because they are somewhat of an outlier. I mean, I suppose if you picture something like the Witchrealm Inquisitors / Haven Knights, and maybe even the Melkor's Chosen or Champions of the White Hand, maybe somewhere in between, that sort of level. But even so, it is obviously a very potent force against enemy cavalry in melee, particularly if you surround them with upgraded Merc cavalry. That's definitely the sort of force which is going to have a lot of cavalry forces worried, especially if you combine that with the fact that you've got crossbows and axe throwers on foot, spearmen, halberdiers and pikes galore. It can certainly leave your opponent guessing what sort of composition you're going to bring, particularly if you're up against someone like Khand or Rohan, who traditionally are quite heavily cavalry reliant. They may have to think again, particularly with someone like Khand, who of course can bring something like their Nurad line. But yeah, very few units are going to want to go one-to-one with the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. They did go through a period of being OP, but they are no longer infantry destroyers as well, only a charge bonus of 5, so they are essentially super melee cavalry. And they do have those lancers, of course, if you want to risk having that charge bonus as well. So Erebor can have quite a potent and varied cavalry line, which certainly differentiates them a little bit from their Khazad-dûm brethren. So now let's go back to the army selection screen and I'll talk about what I think about Erebor. So naturally something to consider is morale, and having a look here you can see that morale, obviously 14 is not great on a militia unit, but it's not bad honestly. Most other militia units would be considerably lower than this. Morale of 13 and morale of 13. Obviously their front line is, I think, a little bit lower in terms of morale than Khazad-dûm, but they have a lot of inspiration units as well, and 13 is not a terrible morale score honestly, so for the most part you're not going to be encountering too many morale problems with Erebor. They do have lower morale than I think Khazad-dûm and the elves, but for the most part you should be fine. You won't be seeing the kind of breaks that you will with a faction like Cardlin or some of the evil men or the orcs, for example. You should be able to keep your ducks in a row with regards to that. But Erebor are really the only faction you can truly compare Erebor to in terms of a one-to-one comparison. You can also compare them to stuff like Gondor, but I think I prefer playing as Erebor than Khazad-dûm, purely because Khazad-dûm, I feel like there's less margin for error with what you do. You have to be very conservative with Khazad-dûm most of the time, whereas with Erebor you have a little bit more license to roam. You have more protection against errant lancers that try and get in behind your lines to really ruin your solid front line, because you have crossbows, you have those more axe throwers that you can field more easily than Khazad-dûm, and of course you have your cavalry, which, centered around the Ironfoot hammer guard, you have a unit of really genuine quality there, which if any enemy cavalry unit gets entangled with them, they're not going to come out of it 100% healthy. Even the strongest of units like the Champions of the White Hand might win against the Ironfoot hammer guard, but it's still not going to look great for them when all is said and done. And honestly, their front line is very solid as well. I mean, the Ironfoot units are very, very good at holding the line, all of them. And then if you sprinkle in a few of these really quality units like the Axe Guard of Erebor and the Erebor Legionaries, and then getting into the General's Bodyguard units, it does look like a smaller roster than some of the others. But honestly, with Erebor, you're going to have a really big advantage when it comes to your infantry against most factions. Now, this isn't universally true, and some factions will be able to sort of exploit some of Erebor's strengths in many ways, in the sense that all of these units, the Ironfoot units, are good, but they're not fantastic. So if you go Ironfoot heavy against someone like Angmar, for example, who can bring the Guardians of Khan Doom and quite a lot of AP and pikes to back them up, then you might find yourselves in a little bit of trouble, which in that sort of situation you might want to go a little bit more quality heavy and maybe try and get round the back with the Ironfoot War Goats. But again, getting into specific compositions is probably more J-Monster's bag than mine, because obviously he's a little bit more experienced with all of these units than I am. But yeah, I do quite like Erebor. I mean, the more variety that you can bring to their compositions suits me a little bit more than Khazad-dûm, I feel. But really, it's up to you. I mean, Erebor's still going to be a primarily defensive faction, just like Khazad-dûm. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely the sort of faction that you can be a little bit more aggressive with, definitely in a slow push situation, where your axe throwers and crossbows are slowly forcing the enemy cavalry and infantry lines into submission, all the while your infantry line just slowly but surely pushes them back. So yeah, by all means, I would like to hear people's feedback on what they think of Erebor. I'm sure the developers would too. And the next faction showcase, we're cycling back around to the Evil Men, so I think it's about time I take a look at the fan favourite that is Harad. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you will join me for that and whatever is next in terms of a battle replay.